In war, women are always at a greater disadvantage compared to men, mainly because it is more challenging for them to defend themselves. During World War II, Hitler's racial doctrine greatly worsened the situation, dehumanizing entire populations. True Aryans were directly advised to do whatever they pleased with non-humans and to feel no pangs of conscience, pity, or even discomfort. Let's take a closer look at how it happened. A conqueror's pleasure. In Germany, as early as the 19th century, so-called research was conducted to establish a link between a soldier's or officer's effectiveness in war and their intimate satisfaction. They also took seriously such important frontline problems as the formation of unhealthy sexual preferences and the spread of venereal diseases. Based on the result of the research, Wehrmacht soldiers were to be provided with brothel services under specific regulations. For these brothels, staffed by German women were formed. However, very quickly, there weren't enough of them for the expanding Wehrmacht, and they simply couldn't keep up with the advancing Hitler's army. In these circumstances, the Nazis pragmatically began using the services of local girls. Efforts were made to carry this out hygienically. Brothels were established with residents based on specific physical criteria, adequately nourished, and monitored for their health. In 1942, there were 500 such establishments in the territories occupied by Germany. In certain establishments, women who had been working prior to the occupation in Western and Central Europe continued their services. However, if they did not meet certain criteria, they could be replaced either willingly or under compulsion. In March 1942, it was ordered to establish institutions on the occupied Soviet territories. In the city of Stalino, a brothel was situated in the Britain Hotel. The team was made up of 26 individuals, encompassing both management and technical personnel. To Kingisepp and Narva, for the organization of the brothel, the girls were forcibly brought from the nearby villages. Refusal to such work or an attempt to escape were punishable by execution. There still weren't enough institutions for everyone, so many followers of Hitler addressed the issue by resorting to outright violence or by forcing women in desperate circumstances into cohabitation. They were blackmailed with persecution for something, for example, for the fact that one of their relatives was at the front, deportation to Germany for forced labor, or took advantage of their poor financial situation. In reality, it was still rape, even though force was not directly applied. If the rapist was an SS man, there were great chances that the victim would be killed by him, because SS members were generally forbidden to associate with inferior people. Soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht were less bloodthirsty. Another way to make up for the shortage of workers in the field of intimacy was street unregistered prostitution. According to the law, these women were required to register. But many did not, even though unregistered prostitution faced severe punishment if caught. In Paris, during the years of occupation, there were over 100 street women involved in prostitution out of necessity. The SS men selected for themselves the youngest and most attractive from those sent to the concentration camps. Army officers forced the mistresses of the houses where they were forcibly quartered to live with them. Pregnancies resulted from both consensual and non-consensual relationships. Women often had abortions outside of medical facilities, and if the children were born, they were frequently killed. Such a case was talentfully depicted by Mom in the novella The Unconquered, 1944. To prevent being forcibly taken to brothels and harassed by Nazis, attractive young girls and women intentionally neglected hygiene, faked illnesses, and even resorted to self-harm, such as cutting and burning their faces. And what is especially important, only the victims of open violence received sympathy. If a woman consented to living with the enemy, even if it appeared voluntary, she was scorned as a traitor. Neighbors could do something vile, and after the expulsion of the occupiers, such women were subjected to repression. For example, in France, they were publicly beaten, shaved bald, and tattooed with swastika. Handmaids. However, intimate issue was not all that Nazis wanted from the inhabitants of the occupied territories. On the conquered land, the Nazis wanted to live comfortably, as the Führer had promised them, and for that they needed maids. If a Nazi was stationed in a house, its legitimate inhabitants were evicted to the basement, barn, or dugout, but the women were obliged to continue to run the household and fully serve the guests. The officer could call upon the young woman in whose house he was quartered, for example, to help him to bathe. High-ranking officers and officials acquired a staff of servants. Since labor exchanges were created for locals, which sent them to work forcibly, it was not easy for women to avoid such employment. In the camps, the guards recruited domestic slaves for themselves, both for intimate and regular services. If they were annoying or the master didn't like how they served, the unfortunate ones were sent to the gas chambers. After the liberation of Belarus, a letter from 15-year-old Katya Suzanina was found in the city of Lyozhna. The girl was in the service of a high-ranking German family and intended to commit suicide due to the unbearable conditions. The separate issue was the export of women to Germany as voluntary workers. They were taken as forced labor somewhat more often than men, since prisoners of war were used as male labor. The exact number of such slaves is unknown, but it is estimated that over the years of war a total of 5 million people were taken from the USSR and more than 3 million from Eastern Europe. Women made up slightly more than half of this amount. Age limit was from 14 to 35 years. The cost of absence of fear. But not all women were so intimidated or concerned about the fate of their relatives as to endure all of the above without a protest. Many women's names have been remembered in the history of the resistance movement across different countries. However, fighting and protesting are neither easy nor enjoyable. Women partisans walked under two Damocles swords at once. They could be exposed by the Nazi or misunderstood and condemned by friends and acquaintances. Sometimes, for effective struggle against the enemy, they had to stay as close to them as possible, which looked like a collaboration. Alexandra Mikhailovna Borisenko, Smolevichi, Belarus, was connected with a partisan detachment named after Kutuzova, but she legally lived and worked in the kitchen for the German military. She was exposed and during the arrest became a witness of the brutal beating of her 2-year-old son, was tortured and sent to the camp. Vera Obolenskaya was taken to France as a child by her parents, white immigrants. During the war, this wealthy aristocrat established contact with the Free French organization, collected intelligence about the Atlantic Wall, and rescued captured Englishmen. In December 1943, she was arrested. The woman was sentenced to death and executed on August 4, 1944, by guillotine. Marina Shafrova-Morutaeva was also an immigrant. The woman lived in Belgium. After the occupation of the country, she immediately joined the resistance. Marina had a radio receiver, translated summaries into French, and printed leaflets herself. On December 8, 1941, right on one of the squares of Brussels, she killed a Wehrmacht major with a knife. Trying to capture her, the authorities took hostages, promising to execute them if the culprit did not surrender. On the way to the commandant's office, Marina Shafrova again killed an army captain. The Belgian queen requested to pardon the mother of 2 children, but that was rejected directly by Hitler, and Marina was executed by guillotine on January 31, 1942.